One of the best, if not the best, sub-DPS support is having her rerun, the almighty Raiden Shogun. After her release in the version 2.1 of Genshin Impact, the Electro Archon, with her high damage potential and her insane ability to battery all elements, has proven that she is indeed one of the most pull characters in the game. This video will not be about why you should pull for Raiden Shogun, because I'm 100% sure that getting her will make your life easier, especially in the Spiral Abyss. So if you ask me, go get her. If you're not yet sure, watch this video until the end and see how versatile and powerful the Shogun is. Hi, this is Earlbedo, and I present to you an updated and an ultimate guide for Raiden Shogun's best teams. We'll run through her kit, team compositions, Raiden Shogun's role in the team, her best builds, and team rotations too. Before we talk about her best teams, let us first talk briefly about Raiden Shogun's kit. Her normal and charge attack without her elemental burst is very normal. Nothing special here yet, so let's move on to her skills. Her elemental skill is very integral to her team's damage. Once activated, it will unveil an electro damage to nearby opponents. This will also grant party members the Eye of Stormy Judgment, which is the purple eye you see above your active character's head. When a character attacks or deals damage, a coordinated attack will be unleashed, dealing electro damage every 0.9 seconds. This is great for applying electro, which will be important as we discuss one of our best teams later. This skill will also buff the active character's elemental burst damage based on their energy cost, up to 0.3% per energy at level 10. For example, Yae has a 90 energy cost, multiply it by 0.3%, and you will get up to 27% buff. You will see here, Yae burst deals around 21,900 initial damage, followed by 29,500 damage. With Raiden Shogun's skill activated, it has increased to almost 24,500 initial damage and 31,400 subsequent damage. Before we talk about her very complex and long elemental burst description, let's run through one of her important mechanics, which is what we call resolve stacks. There are two ways to get this. First is with her passive skill, Wish a Number. This will provide her 2 resolve stacks every time her party members gain elemental orbs or particles with a maximum stack of 60 stacks. This occurs every 3 seconds. She also has an ability, seen in her burst description, to gain 0.2 stacks for each energy spent with elemental bursts of other characters in the team. Giving Yae as an example, 90 energy costs times 0.2 is 18 stacks. You will see how many stacks you have at the back of your active character. Resolve stack is very important for her burst. The Almighty Shogun's elemental burst will deal a very powerful initial AoE electro damage with a very high damage multiplier. During the state, her normal attack, charge attack, and plunging attack will be infused with electro damage, and her resistance to interruption will greatly increase. The damage dealt will be increased based on the resolve stack you collected before activating her burst. At level 10, resolve stack will increase her burst damage by 1.31% per stack. It doesn't end here. She doesn't only deal huge personal damage, but she will also give energy to all her party members every 1 second, maximum of 5 times. This is one of the reasons Raiden Shogun is worth your pulls. Energy recharge is most of the time neglected by most players. Energy plays a big role to burst DPSs and sub-DPSs like Yelan, Xingqiu, and Xiangling. Having the Electro Archon in the team makes energy restoration very easy. Please note that her elemental burst is considered burst damage, so characters like Beidou, where her elemental burst should be triggered by normal or charge attacks, will not have the best synergy with the Raiden Shogun. Her greatness continues with her second passive skill, which gives her extra 0.6% energy restoration from her burst and 0.4% electro damage bonus for each extra 1% energy recharge above 100%. With all this, I recommend to prioritize leveling her elemental skill and burst equally. However, there will be an exception to this, with one of her team comps, which we will talk about more later. Basically, the Raiden Shogun is a very strong DPS with a very strong support capabilities. Woo! That was a lot! But before we proceed to the best team comps, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell too. If you are an old player, you probably know this team already, the Raiden National team. This team is one of the best teams in the game. If you have this, you most likely will devour the Spiral Abyss. Our first team is composed of the Raiden Shogun, of course, then a buffer, which is Bennett, two off-field sub-DPSs, which is Xingqiu and Xiangling. But you can also use Yelan as a substitute to Xingqiu. Yelan will provide higher damage and damage buff, but Xingqiu will give you more hydro application and small heals, so you decide which one works for you. The Electro Archon's role is to be the quick on-field driver of the team while providing a significant amount of damage, all while buffing the bursts of other two sub-DPSs. This is a very effective team as Raiden Shogun will not only buff the team, but also provide a lot of energy to the energy-hungry Xingqiu or Yelan and Xiangling. If you do not know, using these three characters without a battery, especially Xiangling, will be very challenging since they require a high ER. Having the Shogun in the team will satisfy their energy needs. With that, Xingqiu or Yelan and Xiangling will not only be dealing damage, as Xingqiu can provide a small amount of healing. Xiangling can increase a team member's attack by 10% for 10 seconds with Goba's passive. If you pick Yelan instead, she can also boost the active character's damage by up to 50% the longer the character is active. Obviously, Bennett's role is to buff the team's attack and be the secondary battery for Xiangling. So basically, this team is composed of sub-DPS's support monsters. That's why you'll never go wrong with this team. Raiden Shogun's build will be her best standard build that will be applicable to most of the team comps I will mention, except to one. For her artifact, her best slot is the Emblem of Severed Fate. This artifact gives you 20% ER with 2-piece set, which is a lot. And it also gives you elemental damage buff by 25% of your energy recharge up to 75% at 300 ER. That is a huge buff. If you really want to unlock her maximum potential, please farm for this as this has a big difference than the other artifacts that I will not mention anymore. Farming on this domain is very worth it since a lot of other characters like Yelan, Xingqiu, Xiangling, and Beidou can also use this artifact set. You should equip an ER Sand if you haven't yet achieved 250 to 300% ER at max, and use Attack Sense instead if you have reached that ER. For the Goblet, I highly suggest using one with Attack main stat if you do not have her signature weapon, and if you are wearing an ER Sans already, so you don't overcap her ER or elemental damage bonus. Remember, her electro damage increases with her ER, but you can also use ER or Electro Damage Goblet depending on the stats that you lack. This will vary per account, so make sure to do a test. Lastly, wear a crit rate or crit damage circlet that will bring your crit ratio to 1:2. For her weapon, the signature and best one is the Engulfing Lightning. This gives you 55.1% ER stats and up to 80% attack at R1. After using her burst, you will also gain another 30% ER for 12 seconds. What's crazy is her F2P weapon can almost match the signature weapon while being freely obtainable by fishing. So make sure to spend time on fishing to catch as this gives you 45.9% ER, 12% elemental burst crit rate, and it buffs your elemental burst by 32% at R5. But if you're saving or you're just too lazy to fish, you can use the Favonius Lance instead. But obtaining the catch will be more worth it in the long run, and this build will apply to most of her team comps. Let's move on to the rotation. What's good with this team is you don't really have to worry about what reaction you will trigger. Whether it is Overload, Electro Charge, or Vape, this team will deal massive damage. What I like to do first is to release Goba, so after all the setup, Raiden Shogun can pick up the Chili to increase her attack. But this is optional since this might mess up your rotation if you focus too much on the Chili. After that, use Raiden's Elemental skill to activate the buff and so you can see the resolve stacks. Then quickly use Bennett's skill to get particles, then his burst. Switch to Xingqiu or Yelan to do one skill, then burst. Then another skill if you need more energy. Then use Xiangling's burst. She can snapshot, so make sure to do her burst inside Bennett's buff. After that, switch your Raiden Shogun and use her elemental burst. By this time, you can also pick up Goba's Chili if you have the opportunity to do so. Perform normal and charge attacks. Either way, you will deal massive damage. If you have enough ER, you will see that your team's energy will almost be full if not full yet after this full rotation. Just like the national team, this team has been around since the Raiden Shogun was released. In a Raiden HyperCarry team, the template is very simple. It should be Raiden Shogun with 3 support that will buff her damage. Mainly an attack buffer, an animo for resistance shred, and if you need to, a healer or a shielder. The most common one is Bennett that will provide a huge attack buff and healing, though it's almost a staple to have him in this team. Followed by Kojou Sara, who is obviously a dedicated support for Raiden Shogun to buff her attack and give crit damage at C6. Another great support is Kazuha with a very decent Venerer set, as he provides crowd control while reducing enemies' resistance. If you're like me who doesn't have a built C6 Sara, or if you do not have Kazuha or Bennett, other buffers like Farina or Mona can work too. Chevreuse is a great substitute for Kazuha. Even Zhongli as a shielder that will decrease enemies' resistance is great too. Healers like Kokomi with Tenacity of Millet can also be a choice. Raiden's role here is obviously the main damage dealer. With that, her build will just be the same as the national team. So let's move on to the rotation. The rotation is quite simple. Raiden Shogun skill followed by the animo, then all the other buffs. If you use the most common template, after using the Shogun skill, use Kazuha's skill, then burst to reduce enemies' resistance to Electro. It is important to use him after Raiden Shogun so you won't swirl any other elements. Switch to Bennett after, use his skill then burst. Then use Sara's skill and Elemental Burst to finally use Raiden Shogun's Elemental Burst. Use her normal or charge attack, then repeat the rotation. I do not have a built Sara, so here is another one with Mona as a substitute. The next team was introduced to us in version 3 with the release of Dendro and Sumeru. It's the Aggravate Raiden Shogun team. Before I give you the template, let me just first tell you how Aggravate works. It is basically like a vape or melt for Electro and Dendro with additional steps. To trigger Aggravate, you need to first apply a Quicken Aura to the enemy by applying Electro to a Dendro inflicted enemy, or vice versa. After that, you should apply Electro for Aggravate to be triggered, dealing Electro damage. Applying Dendro after Quicken will trigger Spread instead, which is a Dendro damage. Aggravate and Spread are additive reactions, which means they provide an additional base damage bonus that adds to the base damage your character deals, instead of multiplying damage like amplifying reactions. Also, this gets boosted with higher EM. The template should be Raiden Shogun, then a Dendro applicator. The other 2 slots can either be another Electro DPS like Yae Miko or Official, or buffers that will not mess up the Quicken reaction, so do not use Pyro, Cryo, or Hydro here. Animo and Geo have no reaction to Dendro, so they're okay to be used. Kazuha, Chevreuse are great for crowd control and providing EM, while Jean and Sayu are good choices for healers too. Additionally, all of them can wear Viridescent Venerer to shred enemies' resistance to Electro. You can also use Kojou Sara here to buff Raiden. What's great about this team is the roster of Dendro applicators and support we have are actually very great. Nida being the first one, with her EM buff, with her Elemental Burst, and very consistent off-field Dendro application. She is followed by the Dendro MC, then Kole. Then Yao that can also provide healing and can wear the Tenacity of Millet. Also, if you have Nahida, Raiden will not be the sole sub DPS here, as Nahida also outputs tons of damage, which I think is better. Just like the first 2 teams, Raiden Shogun's build will be the same. Though EM can help boost the damage, it is not recommended to use an EM main stat artifact. It's just that having an EM substat will now be appreciated, so don't stress too much about EM. For the rotation, use the Electro Archon skill, followed by your Dendro character skill or burst to apply Dendro. Then all the other buffs, like using your Animo to swirl or crowd control. I would say to not stress too much on who will trigger the reaction after Quicken, as Spread and Aggravate are very strong. Just focus on making sure that Dendro and Electro are being applied consistently. We are now on the second to the last team. And you know what? I think this is the most controversial Raiden Shogun team yet. HYPERBLOOM is a very strong reaction that can obliterate the Spiral Abyss, even if your characters are not well built. For HYPERBLOOM to work, you need to apply Hydro to a Dendro-inflicted character or vice versa to produce this Dendro cores you see here. Then apply Electro to deal a Dendro damage. Note that there can only be 5 Dendro cores at a time. Now that you know how it works, let's talk about why this team for the Electro Archon gained a lot of raised eyebrows, even though it was considered a meta reaction that time. It is important to know that HYPERBLOOM is a transformative reaction, meaning the damage dealt here is determined by your EM and level. This means that building Raiden Shogun with full EM is necessary. This strayed away from her conventional support DPS build, like the one I gave you earlier. This also means that most of her abilities are ignored. Even leveling her talents are not needed, as the only thing needed to her for the team to work is her consistent Electro application. There might also be a more suitable Electro character for this team, which is Kuki Shinobu, who has 100% skill uptime at C2, a very consistent Electro application, and healing. However, for whatever reasons players use Raiden Shogun instead as the Electro trigger for this team, it is undeniable that this team is very reliable. Let's move on to the team template. Here of course you need Raiden Shogun for her long-range coordinated Electro attack with her skill, a Dendro applicator just like in her Aggravate team, and a Hydro applicator, which can consistently apply Hydro like Xingqiu and Yelan. Both of them are also great damage dealers. Gokumi and Barbara can also work as well because they are catalyst users that are also great healers. The last slot is a flex slot for characters that won't ruin the HYPERBLOOM reaction. That means avoid using Pyro here. But what's great is Cryo can also work for this, as they can provide a certain level of crowd control by freezing the enemies. Resistant Shredder like Zhongli will also increase the HYPERBLOOM damage. For the build, we will ignore the build I gave you earlier. This time, the best artifact set to use is the Flower of Paradise Lost, which will give you 80 EM with 2-piece set, which is very important, and up to 80% HYPERBLOOM damage buff. The next best is the Gilded Dreams, which has the same 2-piece effect as the latter. Its 4-piece effect will give you an additional 50 EM for every character with a different element than the wearer. There's a marginal difference between the two, so you may farm whichever domain you need the accompanying artifact set. If you don't have this, you may also use 2-piece set that provide 80 EM. For this HYPERBLOOM team, you need to have a triple EM artifact. Note that Dendro damage bonus will not increase the damage of HYPERBLOOM. For the weapon, use any EM polearm such as Dragon's Bane, the Moon Piercer, or Kitaian Crossbeard. ER is not really needed here, so just pick whatever polearm you have or you prefer. And you might want to try to reach 600 to 1000 EM to enjoy this team. To effectively use the HYPERBLOOM team, apply Dendro then Hydro first or vice versa to create the Dendro cores. Then use Raiden's skill to apply Electro. I do not recommend using her burst since, as mentioned earlier, you don't need to level up her talents. So this might just be a DPS loss. So just focus on reapplying Dendro and then Hydro instead. Using Nahidar Kokumi as a driver will be great since their normal attacks apply elements while triggering off-fielders' damage. We are finally on our last team. I think this is one of the most underrated team, the Raiden Shogun Taser team. Taser team is basically just an electro charge team. I don't see many players use this as much as the teams I mentioned before, but thanks to Fontaine and the release of Arena in the Hydro Dragon Earlbedo, this team made more noise in the version 4. For this team, you just need to have Raiden Shogun for consistent electro application and huge damage, as well as her energy restoration, and a Hydro character to trigger the electro charge, which will deal damage over time. So Hydro DPSs like Earlbedo and Ayato will work well in this team. Sub DPSs like Yelan and Xingqiu are incredible too, since they also have support utilities. Hydro buffers like Farina, who also deals huge damage with her skill, is also a choice. Dokumi and Barbara are also great drivers. Basically, almost all Hydro characters will work here. For the other slots, an Animo buffer will boost the team damage. Her build here should be the typical attack, ER, and crit build just like the first 3 teams. This also applies to her weapons and talents. The rotation here is quite simple. Just use Raiden Shogun skill, then your Hydro character's skill or burst, then use your buffer. After that, switch to Raiden Shogun and use her burst once available. If you have drivers like Kokomi or Sucrose, just use the Shogun's burst every time it is ready, making sure that the Hydro is also applied before using her burst to maximize the damage. The almighty Raiden Shogun has proven that she's worthy of the Archon title, both lore-wise and in the game. She is a very versatile character with a very high value and utility. Surely getting her will make your time in Genshin Impact worthwhile. We reached the end of the video. Again, this is Earlbedo. See you next time!